Aston Martin could already be in crisis, and we're only 2 races into the season. After the Chinese Grand Prix, new data has surfaced, suggesting the Honda engine isn't just underperforming. It might be breaking the car from the inside. We're talking about extreme vibrations, damaged batteries, drivers unable to push, and now, an FIA investigation that could expose something much bigger across Formula One. But here's the part no one is ready for. Because this might not only explain why Aston Martin is collapsing, it could reveal why another team looks untouchable right now. And if that connection is real, this entire championship could change overnight. Stay with me, because the truth behind this story is not what it seems. Subscribe now, because what comes next changes everything. The Chinese Grand Prix didn't just show Aston Martin is slow. It exposed something much worse. Because from the very first laps, the car didn't behave like a normal Formula One car. It wasn't just lacking pace. It was unstable, unpredictable, and most importantly, impossible to trust. Drivers weren't pushing the limits. They were managing the car, lifting earlier, avoiding aggressive inputs, trying to keep everything under control. And that tells you everything. Because in Formula One, when a driver stops attacking, it means something is wrong. But that's only what we could see. What was happening underneath is where things get serious. Every time the car reached peak load, every time the power unit delivered maximum energy, the same pattern appeared. A vibration. Small at first, then building, then spreading through the entire car, through the chassis, into the steering wheel, into the driver's hands. And here's where it becomes critical. Because this isn't just uncomfortable. It's destructive. These vibrations are damaging components, breaking stability, and most importantly, attacking the battery system, one of the most sensitive parts of the new regulations. And once the battery is compromised, everything else follows. Energy deployment becomes inconsistent. Power delivery becomes unpredictable. Performance drops instantly. So Aston Martin is forced to react. They reduce power. They limit energy usage. They protect the system. And just like that, the car becomes slower everywhere. On straights, on exits, across the entire lap. But here's the part most people missed. This isn't random. It's repeatable. Same conditions. Same reaction. Again and again. Which means something very important. This problem is built into the system. Not a one-off failure. Not a setup mistake. A structural issue. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not fixing a component. You're questioning the entire design. And that takes time. Time Aston Martin doesn't have. Because while they are trying to survive each session, other teams are pushing forward. Collecting data. Refining performance. Understanding their cars. Aston Martin is doing the opposite. Less running. Less data. Less understanding. And that creates a dangerous cycle. The less they run, the less they learn. The less they learn, the longer it takes to fix. And the longer it takes to fix, the further behind they fall. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because Aston Martin is not the only one noticing this behavior. Other teams are watching. Engineers are comparing data, looking at patterns, asking questions. What exactly is happening inside that Honda power unit? Why is the energy delivery so unstable? Why do these vibrations appear under load? And more importantly, what does this reveal about the system itself? Because in Formula One, problems like this don't stay isolated. They lead somewhere. And right now, that path is already pointing in one direction. Straight toward the FIA. But what they're starting to investigate goes far beyond just Aston Martin. But what the FIA is starting to uncover is where this stops being just Aston Martin's problem. Because after the Chinese Grand Prix, the focus shifted. From performance to behavior. From results to patterns. And more importantly, from one team to the entire grid. The investigation is not just about why Aston Martin is struggling. It's about how different power units behave under the exact same conditions. Same track. Same temperatures. Same energy limits. And yet, completely different outcomes. Because while Aston Martin is fighting instability, another team is showing something very different. Control. Total control. Mercedes. No visible vibration. No inconsistency under load. No drop in energy deployment at the end of straights. Just smooth, continuous performance. Lap after lap. And that contrast is impossible to ignore. Because in theory, both systems should operate within the same boundaries. The same regulations. The same limits. So now the question changes. It's no longer, why is Aston Martin failing? It becomes, how is Mercedes succeeding like this? But here's where things get even more interesting. Because the FIA is not just looking at what happens. They are looking at how it's measured. How engine performance is evaluated. Under what conditions? At what temperatures? At what load levels? Because in Formula One, the way you measure something can change everything. And there is growing attention around one key detail. What happens when the engine is fully pushed? Not in controlled testing. Not in ideal scenarios. But in real race conditions. Because some behaviors only appear at the limit. Only when everything is stressed to the maximum. And if those conditions are not being fully captured, then part of the performance might be invisible. And that's where suspicion begins. Because some teams believe that certain advantages only exist in that extreme window. A window that is very hard to measure. Very hard to regulate. And incredibly powerful if exploited correctly. Now bring that back to Aston Martin. Because while others might be maximizing that window, Aston can't even reach it. Their system becomes unstable before they get there. The vibrations increase. The battery suffers. The car has to be pulled back. So they never operate at full potential. Which means something very important. They are not just behind in performance. They are operating in a completely different reality. And that's why the gap looks so big. But here's the twist. Inside the paddock, this is no longer seen as a coincidence. Because when one team is this stable, and another is this unstable, under the same rules, it suggests one thing. Understanding. One team has mastered the system. The other is still trying to figure it out. And that difference is everything. Because this era of Formula One is not about building the fastest car. It's about controlling energy better than anyone else. Managing it. Deploying it. Stabilizing it under pressure. And right now, Aston Martin is failing at that. While Mercedes is defining it. So the FIA now faces a critical situation. Do nothing, and risk one team pulling too far ahead. Or intervene, and potentially reshape the competitive order. And that decision will define the season. But here's the part that connects everything. Because even if the FIA steps in, even if they close any gray areas, even if the front of the grid is slowed down, Aston Martin still has to fix their own problem. Their instability. Their vibration. Their lack of control. Because no regulation change will solve that for them. And that leads to a very uncomfortable conclusion. Aston Martin is not just behind. They are disconnected from the level required to compete in this new era. And unless that changes, very quickly, this season might already be slipping away. But there is still one final piece. One detail that explains why this situation is even more serious than it looks. And once you understand it, you realize this is not just a bad start. It's something much deeper. And this is where the situation becomes even more serious than anyone expected. Because until now, there was still one assumption. That Aston Martin's problem is temporary. That with enough time, enough upgrades, enough testing, they will recover. But what if that assumption is wrong? Because inside the team, there is growing concern that this isn't just a fixable issue. It's a limitation built into the system itself. And that changes everything. Because if the root of the problem is structural, if it comes from how the engine, the battery, and the chassis interact, then solving it is not about improving. It's about redesigning. And that is something you cannot do mid-season. Not without massive compromise. Not without losing even more time. And this is exactly why the situation is so critical. Because Aston Martin is not just losing performance. They are losing development direction. They don't fully trust their data. They can't push the car to gather accurate feedback. They can't validate upgrades properly. And that creates something even more dangerous than being slow. Uncertainty. Because when a team doesn't understand its own car, every decision becomes a risk. Every change becomes a gamble. Every upgrade becomes a question mark. And in Formula One, that is the worst position you can be in. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Because while Aston Martin is dealing with uncertainty, other teams are doing the opposite. They are building confidence, refining their systems, pushing harder every race, especially Mercedes. Because their advantage is not just speed, it's clarity. They understand exactly how their car behaves, exactly how their energy system performs, exactly where the limits are. And that allows them to operate at the edge without crossing it. Aston Martin doesn't have that luxury. They don't know where the edge is. Because every time they approach it, the system breaks down. So they stay below it. And in doing that, they give away performance. But here's the final piece. The one that connects Aston Martin's struggle with the FIA investigation and the direction of the entire season. Because this isn't just about one team falling behind. It's about what happens when a team misreads a regulation shift. Because 2026 changed the game. This is no longer an aerodynamic championship. It's an energy championship. And the teams that understood that early are now ahead. Not by chance. by design. Aston Martin believed they could build a strong concept and refine it over time. But the problem is, in this era, if your foundation is wrong, there is no easy recovery. Because everything depends on that foundation. Engine, battery, software, chassis, all connected, all interdependent. And right now, Aston Martin's foundation is unstable. So now the entire season comes down to one brutal reality. They are not chasing performance. They are chasing stability. And those are two very different battles. Because one wins races. The other just keeps you alive. So the real question is no longer whether Aston Martin can fight at the front. It's whether they can even escape the problem they're trapped in. Before the gap becomes permanent. Before the season moves too far ahead. Before the opportunity disappears completely. Because if they don't solve this soon, then this won't just be remembered as a difficult start. It will be remembered as the moment Aston Martin realized they built the wrong foundation for a completely new era. And this is the point where everything stops being about the season and starts becoming about the future. Because what Aston Martin is facing right now doesn't just threaten a few races. It threatens the entire project. The long-term plan. The vision they built around this new era. Because let's be clear, this was supposed to be their moment. New regulations. New power unit partnership with Honda. Adrian Newey shaping the concept. Massive investment. Everything aligned for a breakthrough. And instead, after just 2 races, they are questioning the foundation. And that is the worst place you can be. Because when you lose confidence in your foundation, you don't just fix problems. You start doubting decisions. Every decision. Was the packaging too aggressive? Was the integration rushed? Was the concept too complex for a new power unit? And once those questions appear, they don't go away. They grow. Inside the team. Inside the factory. Inside every meeting. But here's where it becomes even more critical. Because while Aston Martin is questioning, their rivals are confirming. They know their direction is right. They know their system works. They know their development path is clear. And that creates a gap that is no longer technical. It's psychological.